Hey, what's up, guys? This is Rich with Red Phone Video here, and today we're going to discuss a little film called Disconnected in a segment I like to call Horribly Underrated Horror. Now, this movie Disconnected is a bit of an oddity, to say the least. It was one that I rented on VHS way back in the day, and I didn't really care much for it at first, to be honest, and since it was never released on DVD, it was just one of those ones I kind of forgot about as the years went by. But in 2017, Vinegar Syndrome finally put out this Blu-ray of Disconnected, and when I revisited the movie this time around, I remember it hitting me on a more visceral, cerebral level that's kind of hard to describe. Around that time in 2017, I was in post-production on a movie I'd made called Close Calls, which basically utilized the telephone as a harbinger of evil and a metaphor for madness. So from that standpoint, it was refreshing to actually go back and watch this weird little movie from the 80s that dealt with similar themes. And in a way, I just felt like I was more emotionally connected to it. I suppose you could lump Disconnected in with that subgenre of telephonic terror, which of course became popular with films like Black Christmas and When a Stranger Calls. But Disconnected is more of a psychological and artsy approach to the slasher film, which I think separates it from a lot of the formula-driven stuff that was flooding the market around that time. And when I say I was more emotionally connected to Disconnected, it wasn't because the story was just insanely remarkable or compelling or anything like that. It just had this low-budget, grimy feel to it that just spoke to me, and it also felt like a precious time capsule for a very specific era that was short-lived but indelible at the same time. So, just to summarize the plot of Disconnected for you guys. The movie opens up in Waterbury, Connecticut, with a young early 20s girl, Alicia, played by Frances Raines, who comes home to her apartment to find this strange old man lurking around, who she invites inside to use the phone real quick. When the old man mysteriously disappears, though, Alicia tries to recount the story to her boyfriend Mike, played by Carl Koch, and her twin sister Barbara Ann, also played by Frances Raines. Essentially, Mike and Barbara Ann just think Alicia's crazy, and they may or may not be wrong.
Oh, Alicia, you're beginning to sound more like Mother every day. He obviously just made his phone call and left.
Hey, Barbara Ann's right, sweetheart. There's no other explanation, is there?
Meanwhile, you have Detective Tremaglio, played by Carmine Capobianco, who's investigating a series of gruesome murders in the area and giving us a first-person account of the case details in documentary fashion.
Because some sick man is going around killing women. First he sexually abuses them, and then he mutilates their bodies.
As this subplot weaves its way into the story, we cut back to Alicia working at a local video store, where she meets a mysterious, awkward young man named Franklin, played by Mark Walker, who's hell-bent on taking her out on a date.
To tell you the truth, I saw you at the bar last night. Well, I guess you could call me a distant admirer.
Really?
Having trouble with her current boyfriend, Alicia falls further into a state of loneliness and despair. She drinks, she fucking smokes, she suffers from nightmares, and after receiving a slew of disturbing phone calls, Alicia eventually agrees to go out with the persistent Franklin. And this is when the film reels you into its bizarro world of depravity when it suggests that Franklin might be the serial killer who's preying on these young women in the town. Now, this doesn't even come close to summarizing all the events in Disconnected, because there's so many elements in this movie that are stirred together to create this crazy, surreal, and sometimes disjointed narrative. But for me, that's what makes this film so special and unique. It feels like a lot of genre ideas that try to gel and converge, but ultimately end up diverging into their own ambiguous avenues, which I personally think is beautiful, by the way. And I was looking on IMDb recently, and I found that this movie currently holds a 4.4 user rating, which I thought was fucking absurd because this movie is an art house film, and it actually dared to go against the conventions of the genre. And while I think the execution of its ideas is a little lopsided at times, it's the indie spirit, it's the independent spirit of this movie that feels tangible, and for that reason alone, I think it deserves more praise. I'd have to say this movie's low-budget limitations are what people tend to notice first and foremost, which I think is a crying shame because it's the gritty, homemade quality of this movie that gives you a sense that it was crafted by human hands and uncorrupted by corporate studio interference. And sadly, that's a distinctive aspect that I feel is going by the wayside in a lot of modern films, even on the micro-budget level. That uninhibited attitude of let's all go out, have fun, and shoot a movie, that attitude is inherent throughout this entire film. The director, Gorman Bechard, was just this regional filmmaker who placed ads in the Village Voice and the New York Times to raise 40 grand to make this oddball movie, which was based on a short story that his co-screenwriter and girlfriend at the time, Virginia Gilroy, she came up with it, and it was originally titled The Phone Thing. The movie was shot on weekends using 16mm short ends, and you can definitely tell. Even on the Blu-ray, there's this extremely grainy texture that just makes the film feel alive. And since Bechard used this wind-up Bolex camera with a crystal sync motor that didn't quite sync up the sound properly, he was forced to sync up the sound by hand, which resulted in a lot of scenes where the actors' dialogue doesn't quite match their lips.
Look, Barbara Ann, I'm sure you and Joey must have lots of things planned for this evening. We won't hold you up, okay? Bye.
See you, bye.
Again, this is something that I think gives this movie its charm, though. It actually kind of reminded me of a lot of those old indie films from the 80s, from people like Jim Jarmusch, Hal Hartley, Abel Ferrara, and even Kevin Smith when he made Clerks in the 90s. The movie just has a raw, organic feel to it that it draws you in like a garage band at a backyard concert. It kind of has that feel. It feels rugged and tactile. And I'm sure for a lot of folks who've seen Disconnected, they'll probably roll their fucking eyes when I say this, but it's definitely an art house film. It's filled with all kinds of subversions and weird experimental moments that breathe life into an overall shoddy looking production. I mean, to be honest, I wouldn't consider this to be an exemplary film in terms of filmmaking techniques. There's a lot of wide static shots with little to no coverage at all, and the lighting and the composition is overall pretty dull and underwhelming. However, this is one of those movies that actually separates itself from a lot of cheap genre efforts because of its art house approach, which may seem a little jarring at first on the surface. But some of these creative decisions, for better or worse, they actually do stand out and stick with you in a weird way long after you watch it. For instance, there's a scene where our leading lady, Frances Raines, she stands in her apartment in front of a window, completely blown out by the sun rays beaming through. And this might seem like a cardinal sin to filmmakers and cinephiles, but I can't help but think that this was an artistic choice that Gorman Bechard decided to say fuck it and go with, whether it was deliberate or not. Then, there's another scene where the serial killer murders this young woman in his apartment, and after we see the woman's bloody hand spring up into frame and squeeze a blood sponge onto a framed photo, the camera just lingers on the wall for an uncomfortable amount of time, almost to the point where I couldn't help but laugh at this intentionally drawn-out moment. And speaking of laughter, there's definitely a lot of humorous moments in this film, mainly provided by the film's co-star, Carmine Capobianco, who was so damn funny in this movie. Gorman Bechard actually went on to cast him in their next project, Psychos in Love, which is another horribly underrated work of art, in my opinion. If you guys haven't seen Psychos in Love, this was another one that Vinegar Syndrome put out, and it's just as crazy and wild as Disconnected. I'm not going to get into it now, but Psychos in Love, it's a funny as hell horror comedy. It doesn't get near the attention it deserves, much like this one, but anyway, back to Disconnected. Carmine Capobianco, he provides us with a lot of levity throughout the film as the cop character, and I think that's what really pulled me into this story and made me appreciate it for all its multifaceted layers of comedy, horror, and outlandishness.
Now, why do you wear those shirts?
I want to bring a little Tahiti into what the fuck are you asking me?
Even though this easily falls into the horror category, the film feels like a multitude of different genres just thrown together to create this off-kilter atmosphere. It's part slasher film, part character study, part detective crime story, part avant-garde. It's got a little bit of everything, to be honest. And to me, it's a movie about loneliness, paranoia, detachment, relationships, and how our relationship to the inside world and the outside world and the people who occupy these spaces can actually help us examine the unearthly nature of life and death, dreams and reality, sanity and insanity. It's tough to say whether or not the director Bechard intends to convey all this stuff subconsciously or even consciously, but the result of just splattering the paint on the fucking canvas, it creates this otherworldly feel to a movie that completely changes tone after it pulls the rug out from under you in the third act. It's nothing I'd call brilliant, and I wouldn't even say it's anything that transcends the genre, but the direction it goes in the third act is a descent into madness that, for my taste anyway, is something I wish more filmmakers would be eccentric enough to try. This movie's so anti-cathartic that it's almost anti-audience in a way, because it poses questions and leaves you with an unexplained mystery that's almost a big fuck you to moviegoers who are craving something formulaic that doesn't go against their expectations. But as much as I could say Disconnected is anti-moviegoer, it's also very pro-movie.
All these films. You must like films to work in a place like this. You like movies, don't you?
Very much so.
I knew you would.
This is a film that clearly shows you how much it loves movies. There's classic movie posters all over the walls of Alicia's apartment, most fittingly a Dial M for Murder poster. There's the fact that Alicia works in a video store, and when she goes on a date with Franklin, the two go out to see a movie. Then they spend the whole time walking home just talking about movies.
I don't know. I really like the old movies best. Ones with real stories and real actors. You know, ones that don't rely on sex and violence to get an audience.
Disconnected's also a film that just embraces pop culture in general. Everything from the movies, the music, and the fashion that encapsulated that early 80s period. Like I said, this movie's a time capsule. And technically all movies are, to be honest, but very few films are actually able to crystallize all their quirks and be a product of their time without coming across as dated.
I feel like I'm stuck right in the middle of a low-budget horror film.
Why do you say that?
The film's 40 fucking years old now, but it has an underlying edge to it that hasn't waned in the attitude of modern artists. You have these extraordinary little scenes that take place in nightclubs with these bohemian hipster types who were all over the place during that whole post-punk, new wave, pop-punk movement. You have the scenes with Alicia working at the mom-and-pop video store, which were so niche and idiosyncratic, it just made the film feel like more of a rarity that deserved to be cherished. Overall, I think the reason why this film feels so precious to me is because it was made during an era when low-budget films were raw. They were gritty, they were imbued with that indie spirit, and completely unfettered by studio influence. Also, regardless of what people think about the actors in this movie, I personally loved all the performances from the leads. Now, I already mentioned the late, great Carmine Capobianco as the cop character, but real quick, I just want to point out the performance from Mark Walker, who played the awkward as fuck Franklin in the film. Horror fans might recognize him from films like Rabid and The Vindicator, but I thought he did a pretty good job overall at playing this insecure, weird creep character, especially in all the scenes he shared with Frances Raines.
Was that your boyfriend you were with last night?
What? Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say hi.
Now, speaking of Frances Raines, she is honestly the reason I've revisited this movie numerous times. I never get tired of watching her in this film. I've always been a big horror guy, so I would see this chick in movies like The Mutilator, Breeders, and more recently, Late Phases. But in Disconnected, Frances Raines carries this film completely. Her performance isn't top-notch or anything, but she's interesting. She's likable, and she's easy on the eyes. Frances Raines spends a lot of time in this movie just lumbering around her apartment half naked, questioning her sanity and falling further into a state of depression as she's tormented by delusions, nightmares, and the unnerving phone calls. And she does such a good job at portraying the introverted Alicia that she's almost unrecognizable as her more uninhibited twin Barbara Ann. All in all, this movie's a winner for me, guys. Considering the restrictions of the low budget, I'd have to say the performances from the main actors are pretty adequate. And the gritty atmosphere gives it a vibe kind of like Abel Ferrara's The Driller Killer, or something like Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. It's not necessarily comparable to those films in terms of tone, but I think if you like that kind of down and dirty aesthetic, then you'll definitely appreciate Disconnected. From a creative standpoint, like I said, this movie just makes bold alternative choices that accentuate the deranged nature of this bewildering schizophrenic narrative. And I really liked the moment towards the end with the still photos that reminded me of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, by the way. It's a fucking punk rock movie with punk rock sensibilities, and since it's horribly underrated and sadly overlooked, my personal ranking of this film would have to be about a 3.5 out of 5. I'm going with 3.5 because, to be honest, this is a movie that'll be balked at by most, but for the most part, it'll be embraced by weirdos. And with that, guys, that's all I have to say about Disconnected. I don't know what else to say about Disconnected other than get connected. Get connected to it. Let it confuse you, annoy you, and consume you. If you appreciate trash cinema and batshit gonzo stuff, this movie should be right up your asshole. Even if you like highbrow stuff like Repulsion, Personal Shopper, or House of the Devil even, there's things in Disconnected that share a lot of similarities with those films. So that is it, guys. If you haven't seen Disconnected and you want to check it out, be sure to pick up this Blu-ray. You may not be able to get the limited slipcover anymore, but there should be some copies of this movie still floating around on Vinegar Syndrome or on Amazon. And if you have seen Disconnected, let me know your thoughts on this crazy-ass movie in the comments. I appreciate you tuning in, guys. You've been listening to Rich with Red Phone Video, and if you enjoyed this little segment of horribly underrated horror, then I'll definitely do more of these in the near future. But until next time, take care, stab the like button, keep watching awesome horror movies like Disconnected, and I'll catch you next time.
And then?
And then I'm going to take a nice long vacation.